After over 30 years of left-wing rule, it's no coincidence Brazil has seen rising violence tied to criminal factions. Unprecedented. Previously or more recently, chaos in Rio de Janeiro, highlighted by the recent operation that killed hundreds of drug traffickers, has become even worse on the national stage. The North and Northeast regions have also taken on this sad prominence, and most likely in an even worse situation than that of Rio de Janeiro, especially in the states of Ceará and Bahia, where there are signs that this public security crisis is taking on dangerous proportions. Well-defined geographical contours with regional pockets of intense conflict to the point of showing typical characteristics of a low-intensity internal conflict practically becoming a kind of undeclared civil war. To provide context, I have listed some significant episodes from recent years that show the offensive actions of the factions and the very weak response from the state. In 2019, there were already signs of what was to come, a wave of orchestrated attacks, with more than 40 incidents in 13 municipalities. In just a few days, buses and public buildings were set on fire, with criminals even blowing up a viaduct with dynamite. And a letter left at the scene warned that this was just a sample of what would happen if the government kept strict measures in the prisons. The governor then requested federal support, and hundreds of agents from the national force and the army were sent to contain the crisis. The attacks were a unified reaction from the main factions, Comando Vermelho, Primeiro Comando da Capital, and the Local. Guardiões do Estado, against the decision not to separate prisoners by faction and to tighten prison discipline. Later in 2021 in Amazonas, Comando Vermelho carried out simultaneous attacks in Manaus and neighboring cities during 8 hours of terror after the death of one of its leaders. According to the police, 21 vehicles were set on fire, of which 14 were buses, cars, police vehicles, and even an ambulance. And several public buildings were vandalized. Criminals set up barricades, blocked important roads, and left Manaus practically under siege during those nights. Later in 2023 in Rio Grande do Norte, an unprecedented wave of violence in that state happened in retaliation for the state's attempt to impose tougher conditions on prisoners. For 10 days they were rejected. There were 298 attacks recorded in dozens of cities, with 104 attacks on the first day alone, targeting both public buildings and government vehicles, businesses, and even residences. And in the same year in Bahia, there were arson attacks on buses in Salvador. These attacks in urban areas of Salvador reflect both local drug trafficking disputes and acts of retaliation against police operations in the interior of Bahia. Clashes between police, rival gangs, and confrontations between these gangs and the police resulted in dozens of deaths among suspects. They prompted the state government to seek national force support for certain operations. And now in 2025 in Ceará, which was already in a chaotic situation long before, things have gotten even worse. Organized crime orders force quick evacuations of villages, neighborhoods, and districts. A school shooting in Sobral Ceará revealed that even children and teenagers are not safe. The investigation confirmed that it was an action coordinated by factions, with the shooter being arrested and identified as a member of the Primeiro Comando da Capital, and the target was a 16-year-old student who was connected to the Comando Vermelho. These episodes illustrate the rivalry between the Primeiro Comando da Capital and the Comando Vermelho. Previously restricted to prisons and the outskirts, it now openly invades public spaces, increasing fears of a Mexicanization of parts of Brazil. If the situation of rampant crime, with the state being expelled from parts of the city, as happens in Rio de Janeiro, generates reasons for national shame. The situation in the Northeast is evolving to another level of urban and rural conflict, with no recent precedent in Brazil's history, with factions fighting over territories like rival armies. At a level of organization, scale, and aggressiveness much greater than what we saw in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. The father of geopolitics, the German Hatzel, described the state as an organism that expands in space, where the border is just a pause in its growth. He uses the term Lebensraum, or living space, to describe the condition in which a nation people needs space to survive and grow. He values the geographic dimension as a factor in the political development of nations, and although Hatzel does not specifically address civil wars or separatist movements, these assumptions ended up implying that if a state organism loses cohesion or if separations occur, this can be seen as a rupture of the state's existential capacity. For him, a correct state policy is to prevent the dissensions that occur within a society from turning into geographic conflicts. This technically means the risk of internal dissension, where the political-social conflict is either factional rivalries or power struggles between groups, with the foundation being the economic or ideological aspect within the same state. When internal dissension takes on a territorial form, it ceases to be just a political dispute and becomes a spatial dispute. This is the geographicization of the conflict, when dissension is anchored in the land, in the border, in the space. And this needs to be clear here. This view of Hatzel has been confirmed in all crises around the world. In recent centuries, all crises that took on geographical contours evolved into civil wars. This ceases to be a mere crisis and in modern terms becomes separatism, territorialized civil war, regional secession, insurgency with control of territory. Because for Hatzel, when the conflict becomes spatialized, you no longer have just a political problem, you have the fragmentation of the state organism itself. And an organism that loses parts of its body is already on the verge of death, fighting for its own life. But what we're seeing now is exactly that. A change in the geography of violence in Brazil and the materialization of a crisis that was previously more scattered, which I believe is the first truly real threat to the fabric of the country's state structure. But, and this is important, very important, despite the dispute over drug trafficking routes, what you have to understand is that drug trafficking nowadays for these organizations is already a smaller part of their financial activities. That's why this changes the whole equation up to this point about the reason why. We're not talking about normal organized crime, in quotes, because these organizations have evolved into, pay attention, administrative management of the territory. In other words, actually acting as a state, a parallel government, in fact, in many cases, an autonomous state. They make money from legal commerce, from maintaining security, and from administrative taxes and fees, which may seem like little and is something underestimated by politicians, judges, and other authorities. It shows the initiative to go beyond mere drug trafficking to achieve complete territorial autonomy. And, as in the case of the Northeast, we're not just talking about scattered slums spread throughout the city, but about villages, districts, cities, and even entire regions. This shows that we're talking about a much, much larger territorial scale. So we have the geographic distribution, the materialization of power that opposes the state on a real level, almost becoming something formal. We're talking about something that has already evolved from the dispute over drug trafficking to taking on a political position and absolute territorial control. Although the country has recorded a slight overall decrease in homicides in recent years, the Northeast is going against this trend. The region now makes up nearly half of the country's murders. For the first time since 2020, the state of Rio de Janeiro is no longer among the top 3 in absolute numbers of homicides. That position is now held by Bahia, Pernambuco, or Ceará, which are the 3 most violent states in Brazil. Today, they are in the Northeast, far surpassing states with much larger populations, such as São Paulo and Minas Gerais. The expansion and fragmentation of organized crime have led to multiple wars for local control. A Ministry of Justice survey found 14 gangs already operating in northeastern prisons. This fragmented mosaic fuels constant rivalries and makes it difficult for the authorities to maintain control. Bahia is a good example of this reality because it is the state that currently has 5 of the 10 cities with the highest homicide rates in the country. Medium-sized municipalities like Jiquié, Juazeiro, Camaçari, Simões Filho, and Feira de Santana have rates between 70 and 80 murders per 100,000 inhabitants, levels higher than those of some war zones around the world. According to local prosecutors, territorial disputes between factions are the main factor behind these alarming numbers. Local criminal groups and national organizations join forces and clash in the fight for control of these municipalities. The dynamics are fluid, with alliances forming and breaking apart, subgroups emerging, and the crime map in the cities changing very quickly, as Faction A expels Faction B or vice versa. This volatility keeps violence rates high, with constant clashes over drug selling points and control of strategic routes. Ceará saw its security situation worsen drastically from the mid-2010s onward, with the arrival and formation of factions. Until then, the state did not have any structured local factions. However, the expansion of Primeiro Comando da Capital and Comando Vermelho throughout the Northeast catalyzed the emergence of local and regional groups in 2016 after the alliance between Primeiro Comando da Capital and Comando Vermelho was broken. The faction Guardiões do Estado was born in Fortaleza, founded by dissidents from the Primeiro Comando da Capital, and quickly spread throughout the prisons and outskirts of Ceará. Since then, a complex chessboard has been established, with GD allying itself with the Primeiro Comando da Capital. Meanwhile, Comando Vermelho sought support from other groups, including Família do Norte, a faction from Manaus. Then they began fighting for control of Ceará. Since then, Fortaleza and other parts of Ceará have lived in constant tension. Outlying neighborhoods of the capital have become red zones, where public authorities have a hard time entering or sometimes don't enter at all, and armed groups impose their own rules. And hundreds of families had to hurriedly abandon their homes in Fortaleza under police escort, after being threatened and expelled by gang members. These cases of forced eviction happened in the Boa Vista neighborhood and in other communities, where gangs linked to the Red Command invaded territories previously controlled by rivals, such as the local faction Massa Carcerária, and started marking their invisible borders. Residents were warned that, supposedly because they had ties to the enemy group, they needed to leave or they would be killed. Military police officers reported that these expulsions happened almost daily, both by the actions of the Red Command and by rival factions spreading throughout the capital, metropolitan region, and the interior of the state. In other words, it's no longer an exaggeration to say that we are genuinely talking about the phenomenon of war refugees on Brazilian territory, a displacement phenomenon normally associated with armed conflicts and ethnic cleansing. But now here in Brazil, in Bahia, the most populous state in the Northeast, one of the country's most violent gangs has emerged in recent years. Bonde do Maluco expanded, dominating parts of Bahia's capital and countryside. An ally of the Primeiro Comando da Capital and an enemy of the Comando Vermelho, the group is leading a bloody war for control of drug trafficking in the state. This war is fought both against the Comando Vermelho, which is also seeking territory in Bahia, and against independent local sub-factions. In Bahia, factional conflicts have a significant economic aspect. The state has become a logistical hub for international drug trafficking. Ports in Bahia and nearby coastal areas, such as Natal in Rio Grande do Norte and Fortaleza in Ceará, began serving as export routes for cocaine to Europe and Africa. By bypassing the heavy surveillance at ports in the southeast, this attracted the interest of the Southeast Organization. In recent years, the Primeiro Comando da Capital and the Red Command have expanded their franchises to the northeast, either co-opting local gangs or entering into direct conflict over these lucrative corridors. Police sources indicate that the Red Command has been expanding its territories in Bahia and neighboring states. After realizing that the Primeiro Comando da Capital was more focused on international trade, controlling routes in Bolivia, Paraguay, and transatlantic shipments, rather than selling internally here in the country. In other words, the Red Command took advantage of the space left by the Primeiro Comando da Capital in the domestic retail market and aggressively advanced into strongholds in the north and northeast. This highly competitive context makes Bahia a powder keg. On one side, local factions, born in reaction to the invasion of outside factions, are using increasingly violent methods, including terrorist attacks and the filming and sharing of rival decapitations on social media. To maintain their dominance, on the other side, Primeiro Comando da Capital and Comando Vermelho are financing and supplying weapons to their allies, increasing their firepower. Signs already resemble pre-insurgency situations. Examples from Ceará, Bahia, Rio Grande do Norte, Amazonas, and other northern and northeastern areas suggest we face more than ordinary crime. Several typical elements of civil conflicts are present in these regional crises, not only because of the level of organization, the amount of money involved, and the degree of weaponry used, but above all because of the focus on destabilizing state policy. And if you add to that the limit that the geopolitical methodology sets for geographic boundaries, that's the perfect recipe for disaster, which is summarily ignored and underestimated as still being conventional crime by congressmen, judges, and other authorities. Notably, dangerous territorial control and the rise of parallel states stand out, no longer just in marginalized slums but in entire districts and cities, as happened in Viraponga, in Ceará, a rural district that became a ghost territory after gangs expelled its inhabitants. In these places, criminals impose curfews, expel unwanted residents, charge fees, and dispense their own form of justice. On the state's margins, a clear struggle for local governance echoes controlled zones. No longer militias of immigrants like we see in Rio de Janeiro, but guerrillas or warlords. As I mentioned, the rise of internal refugees and forced displacement has grown with intensifying faction wars, creating so-called urban displaced people, with hundreds of families who had to abandon their homes because of violence, which is something seen in such numbers only when we're talking about conventional wars. Terrorist factions use terror tactics to apply pressure, with coordinated arson attacks on dozens of buses, the use of advanced explosives against public facilities, simultaneous attacks at multiple locations, all of this to create widespread panic and challenge state authority. There is high lethality and brutality which causes armed clashes between factions to reach levels of lethality that are already equal to or even surpass those of formal wars. In 2017, Brazil reached 64,000 homicides, a number higher than many civil wars, largely driven by the carnage in the north and northeast during that period. Besides the numbers, the barbarity is also shocking. We see the discovery of private prisons, places of torture, and body dumping sites where gangs eliminate their rivals. And finally, videos of summary executions circulating on apps use both to intimidate rivals and to control communities through terror. This systematic cruelty against civilians and enemies is another parallel with high-intensity civil conflicts. Its parallel can be seen in what we saw with the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria and Al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq. Several factors explain why this crisis took on geographical contours in Brazil. First of all, the national drug policy, which focuses only on armed confrontation with trafficking and not on combating consumption, which is the fuel for this violence, which, added to the fact that Brazil is a route for international trafficking, brings huge amounts of money into the country. And this even explains the lack of willingness from government authorities to actually do something about it. This also explains how a scenario was created where multiple factions fiercely compete for a highly profitable illegal business. The Northeast, which never developed adequate infrastructure or education and even replaced the historical patronage of the old coronelistas, created a population that is excessively dependent on the state, and it ended up being an easy target for factions from the southeast, who expanded their operations into the northeast, co-opting local gangs to now act under their banner, thus creating this clash of influences. Although the drug lords do not have explicit ideological motivations, they exercise de facto political power in their areas, challenging the federal pact and the state's monopoly on force. The risk in the future is that this geographic spread of the crisis will increase, meaning that large portions of Brazilian territory could become chronically unstable and violent. This will generate even more war refugees who will migrate even more to the already saturated states of the south and southeast. A disastrous scenario, dangerously similar to what we saw in China during the 19th century, the so-called Century of Shame, which was originally the driving force behind the fall of the Qin dynasty and the territorial fragmentation of the empire. And only after several decades of chaos did the first ideological movements actually emerge. And again, this is something ignored and underestimated by politicians and authorities who insist on seeing it as mere organized violence, in quotes, normal and not as a geopolitical risk. And in geopolitics, geopolitical risks are those that can destroy the state for good. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to share the video with everyone you know, and if you really like the channel, join World Geopolitics as a member. As a member, not only will you get early access to the videos, but you'll also have access to videos exclusive to members, like a cyber intelligence course I offered to members, or the United States geopolitical history, China's military history, and so on. And also, of course, the exclusive live streams with me, as well as making sure that the World Geopolitics channel keeps existing. Hugs, and see you in the next video.